Hey guys, it's Luke Johnson from Noetic, the humanities teaching app. Go download it for your iPhone and Droid devices. I'm joined by CJ Eller and Jordan Cline. What are we going to be discussing tonight, CJ?
Well, I think we're going to be discussing David Foster Wallace's essay, Consider the Lobster.
Yes, I love how you threw that accent in there. Now, you are responsible for choosing this essay. What made you want to choose this essay?
Well, I think David Foster Wallace is one of those thinkers that everyone should at least experience in some way. And a lot of the times I think we think, okay, we have to read Infinite Jest, which is his giant 1,000 or so page tome that is, to many, widely considered his magnum opus, and respectably so. But it's so dense, right? I mean, I know you even tried to read it.
I continue to read it.
I'm
like a tenth through it.
Right. At what rate? Has it been like a couple months? Right?
Yeah, it's been slow.
Right. Where if you think of just like, okay, you have to approach David Foster Wallace just through that, it would be rather...
It's intimidating.
But to take his thought process and use an essay to explore that, I think is equally valuable because his thinking comes through in this. And I haven't read Infinite Jest, so I don't know if his mode of thinking comes through in this essay as it does in his fiction. But for me, his essays were my first impression of him, and I think they still are quite prevalent, at least in how I think of how he thinks. So I thought it'd be a good idea maybe to get into it.
I think it was an excellent choice. Yeah. I had no idea what we were getting involved in until you suggested it, and then I read it, and I was like, man, this is not what I thought it was going to be.
Which is a cool part about this essay, because it is, you'll describe, journalism, but then it's almost as if he takes this seemingly pedantic, like, I'm going to go look at a lobster festival and talk about it, and just takes all the nooks and crannies that it could contain philosophically and really just puts it under the magnifying glass.
Yeah. Jordan, would you like to say anything before we jump into it?
I definitely, I think this is, an awesome pick, because I think that a lot of times with David Foster Wallace, it's, this sort of aura of just being untouchable, right? Of, I can't read that, but I thought this was very accessible and just a fun read.
Yeah, I think so.
It poses a lot of, serious questions, but in a very sort of palatable way.
It's very clear, right?
Yeah,
It's not... So if anyone ever wanted to check out David Foster Wallace, this would probably be an excellent jumping-in point. It's not...
It's a good gateway.
Yeah, there aren't the layers, the intimidating language that, like you said, his magnum opus necessarily has. So let's say a little bit something about the background. Look, we've already talked about the person that is David Foster Wallace. You can look him up on Wikipedia. He doesn't really need much of an introduction. But the background of this piece does. And so it was originally published in August 2004 of the Gourmet magazine, right? And it's a review of the 2003 Maine Lobster Festival, and it ended up generating some controversy among the readers of the culinary magazine. I'm getting this from Wikipedia. And the reason why it generated so much controversy is that David Foster Wallace, I think it's incredible that we had an intellect and a writer like David Foster Wallace going around doing articles in magazine publications. That's insane to think someone of that massive intellect was devoting themselves to this sort of thing. And perhaps Gourmet magazine should have anticipated what they were going to get, but he ends up not so much giving a sensuous description of the 56th Maine Lobster Festival, right, as he does give us a bioethics treatise on animal suffering and liberation and vegetarianism and things of that nature. So it ended up, the first half of it, is kind of just an aesthetic sort of description of his detached irony at this lobster festival, but the back half of it is super dense and really rich philosophically, and we'll get into that a little bit. So, do you mind if I set the stage here and kind of say what happens? So, like I mentioned, he goes to the 56th Lobster Festival in Maine. And there are 100,000 people there, and I talked about the ironic detachment that he has about all the festivities, the parades, the people dressing up, all of that. And he says, everyone knows what a lobster is, and tells us about the taxonomic categorization of it. Lobsters are the scavengers, the crustaceans, the garbage men of the sea. And something that's going to be important in our conversation when we consider the lobster is knowing a little something about the nervous system of the lobster. It has a decentralized nervous system. It is unlike ours. We have a cerebral cortex that is, a lot of neuroscientists think that that's responsible for higher order thought and qualitative sensations and things like that. But apparently what lobsters has, their brain is more spread out throughout their entire body. It's not centralized in one point. They are essentially giant sea insects. They're arthropods. And interesting, historically, Jordan knows a lot about history in New England and things of that nature, right? Who were they eating? Who ate these things like 400 years ago?
I mean, like prisoners and people who were like institutionalized according to him, and
it
was cruel and unusual punishment to feed a lobster to inmates more than like once a week. It's like crazy stuff.
It was on the same par as like forcing someone to eat like a rat or something like that. They were so great. I mean, and really, you have to think, you're like, they're so grotesque looking. Why on earth would you ever eat a lobster, right? Mm-hmm. Like, they look like aliens. There was, I thought there was an interesting little Kierkegaardian vibe here before we get into the animal liberation stuff, the animal ethics stuff. When he's talking about tourism, I thought there's a little footnote. He says, international tourism is antithetical to true individuality. He talks about tourism as escapism, and he saw all these people sort of descending upon this place, having nothing to do, and using this lobster festival to distract themselves. I think that's a kind of a Kierkegaardian theme, that tourism can be sort of an exotic form of lunarism and sadness. And it seems like I've always thought this, and I'm sure many other people have done much more research on it, that David Foster Wallace and Kierkegaard are sort of kindred spirits in this way. And what's really interesting is he talks about tourists is how they may have a lot of economic significance. They're existentially repugnant, he says.
Mm-hmm. Like a bug on a dead thing.
Yeah. And he gets pretty contemptuous here.
Yeah.
And then just a little bit more about the modern appeal of lobsters. Part of the reason why they're so highly valued in our modern society is there's no decomposition of them. They're alive. You pick them out of a tank and you throw them right into the boiling water and you wait 45 seconds and you got your lobster or whatever, right? But this is where things get kind of dark, right? And it starts with talking about how they have to bind the claws of the lobster because they're not accustomed to being in those cramped spaces with the ultraviolet light. And what they'll do if they don't put the rubber bands on is they'll start destroying and killing the other lobsters, not unlike how chickens, when put into factory farms, have to be debeaked or else they'll start killing the other chickens, and cows have to be dehorned. And so now we're getting into this territory of talking about factory farming and the ethics of that. So here's where the heavy stuff gets going. Before I get into it, would anyone like to say anything else about the description that I just gave?
I think it's important to note, just like you said in the beginning, how much of a weird turn it takes, because you think he's just going to glorify the festival. He's like, oh, it was wonderful. It was a lot of fun. The tent was really grand. And maybe that's what the readers expected, but then he gives this description of just how bleak, and I think he has this thing where it's like you hear all these noises, you're just like cramped in this large tent with people just banging into you, eating lobster and making
drunk
all
people,
these
children,
children, and people making all these sounds, and most of them not eating sounds. You know what I mean? Where it's just grunts and just and I think that really plays into this idea that you talked in the beginning of this. I don't even want to call it gonzo journalism, but the sense where you expect he's going to do one thing, and then he's just like, wait a minute, let's really dig into what this is. And I think it connects to what we're like, the consumerism is going to connect into the idea of killing animals, or at least taking a sentient creature and using it for our, I think, as David Foster Wallace says, our gustatory pleasure.
Yes.
It's going to connect, even though we're just describing a lobster festival, or at least David Foster Wallace is. It's going to connect back to consumerism, and to this point that, like, once I think it was George Perkins Marsh, who was this writer in the 19th century, late 19th century, who wrote this grand opus called Man and Nature, which is this, and just decries our misuse of nature. And he goes into this idea that, like, once we became more prosperous, we were able to consume animals, or at least that animal meat was more of a thing to be open to everyone. And I think that's going to just tie right into... I mean, just the fact that we have a lobster festival and that we can just go and have a weekend of eating lobster. It says something about maybe our affluence and of the consumer culture. And as we're going to discover that we can then be amazed by the world's largest lobster cooker that holds about, 300 or so lobsters.
It's a lot.
Yeah, or he'll describe it later. But yeah, I just wanted to say that what you said was spot on, and that I think it connects to the bigger ties of, I don't know, just about animal treatment.
Yeah, there'll be a moment to explore that. Yeah, there'll be no, it's fine. And there'll be a moment to explore that a little bit more, because we'll get to the conclusion of the essay, trying to think back about what is the nature of the Lobster Festival and how we're supposed to view it after he takes us through all this. Before I go into that, let's get Julie on the microphone.
I would say that the one thing that I really liked was the commentary on tourism, and I think that what really stood out to my mind was this one article that I read a few years ago by James Redfield, and it's called Herodotus the Tourist. So I'd like to read it all.
Please.
To help situate it. The tourist makes no attempt to fit in. He rather accepts a specific social role, that of a foreigner. In doing so, he shows himself comfortable within his own culture, which is strong enough to sustain him even in his temporary position as an outsider. And then I'll just get down to the tourist travels over the foreigner, which is to say he travels in order to come home. He discovers his own culture by taking it with him to places where it is out of place, and discovers specific contours by taking it to places where it does not fit. Tourism is thus both a proof and a source of cultural trauma.
So now that's the first time I've heard that, and that was a very beautiful and well-constructed paragraph or two. In short, what do you think he's saying there?
It's the idea that just, when people say the kind of the cliche in a way of travel changes you.
Yeah.
It's that point where he's saying, it's sort of humbling in a way that you realize that you are not a part of the culture that you're visiting. And I think that this sort of concept for me of foreignness also applies to the sort of foreign relationship that we have with our food, and the sort of detached sort of the plotting of I show up, I get my lobster bib, get my plate,
so what you're trying to say is that maybe David Foster Wallace has pointed out here that there is not only are we alienated to the places that we visit, but we're alienated to the food processing.
Food. Yeah. So we're alienated in the one sense of we don't really, when you travel somewhere, how much time do you really take to learn about a place? You go to the hot spots that Photo's Guide says to go, and you catch a plane and you head home. And so I think that there's that sense of sort of disinterest and degree of sort of disengagement, right? We don't have relationships with our dinners anymore. My mom growing up had this pig named Judy, and she loved this pig. They were tight. And one day my mom came home and was like, so
Judy's for supper.
Where's Judy? And my grandpa was like, well, she's dinner.
Yeah.
So a lot of people don't have that relationship with food anymore, and I think that we've become very apathetic to these sort of processes in which we kill and consume animals.
And I wonder if that connects maybe to segue into what we're talking about, of just being a human being, or being of the human species of this earth, that to have this higher status of being able to manipulate our surroundings, we have to have some sort of detachment from it.
Yeah.
Right? That we are, that in some sense we think that the world is for our consumption and our, quote unquote squandering, I guess, if you really want to call it that. Where a tourist might have that sensibility too, or at least when I go to, I don't know, a beach or whatever, I think it's there for me to enjoy myself and to have a good time. So yeah, it's this tour, like you said, Jordan, or like James Redfield said too, it's this tourist mind frame, even to how we take the world. Yeah.
Right, that we're aliens here. Right,
yeah.
And this will play into some cultural anthropology, right? In the sense that really this isn't our proper home. that our proper home is elsewhere, and this is one of the justifications for why we can subjugate beings that are not human. Right? That ultimately we are some mixture of earth and sky, right? So we'll get to that in a second. But all of these themes we will explore in greater detail after I get through this. We gotta get to the substance of this.
Yep.
So David Foster Wallace asks the loaded and very casual question that sets off this line of argumentation, this confused line of argumentation, because it doesn't really have a point. He's going to create different arguments, but he's just kind of working out in this public space how he feels about eating another being. And he asks the question, is it all right to boil a sentient creature alive just for gustatory pleasure? Is it all right? Right? Like, so that's what he's asking, this question of morality, and its justification is by just saying, is it all right?
Though it's great because he always has this one step ahead sort of mind frame, because he's just like, is this question too PC? Like, what does it mean for it to be all right? Yeah. Like, what does that even mean? Is it all right?
Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of how he's going to adjudicate whether it is all right to enjoy another being, specifically the lobster for our gustatory pleasure, is he borrows two criteria from the ethicist Peter Singer, and I just now realized that I have his book on my shelf over there, Animal Liberation. And in that text, he has two main criteria for why ethicists might think that animals suffer, and therefore we should not eat them. The first is, we have to take into consideration, something I've already mentioned, is how much neurological hardware does the animal have for the experience of pain? All right. And second, we have to take in consideration if the animal exhibits behavior that is congruent with that of experiencing pain. Okay. Now, one of the things that happens when he's at the Lobster Festival is that he sees animal rights activists, PETA activists, handing out pamphlets to people in line. And there's sort of this like uneasy harmony. They're kind of part of the whole festivity. No one is really in each other's faces, but they're kind of just there talking about how like eating the lobster is murder or something like that. And in a more coherent way, I've sort of scripted in accordance with these criteria. I've sort of scripted what the PETA argument essentially is, and I'm gonna get your response to it. Mm-hmm. All right. So the question the PETA person might say is the matter of eating lobster a personal choice, or is there a definitive moral prohibition? All right. So is it relative or is it universal? Mm-hmm. PETA says it's not a matter of personal conscience. It's not going to be perspectival. It's not going to be relative. It's going to be the same for Jordan, for CJ, for Luke, right? Why? And if we apply the two above criteria, lobsters have a primitive nervous system that allows them to feel pain. And B, lobsters exhibit behavior that demonstrates felt pain, i.e. the thrashing in the pot when you boil them alive. Mm-hmm. Now, from the application of the criteria, it would seem that lobsters suffer. And it's wrong for any creature to suffer for our gustatory pleasure. Therefore, it is not right to boil lobsters alive for us. Further, this logic might extend to other higher animals as well. Cows, chickens, dolphins, monkeys, whatever. And David Foster Wallace, I want to get your guys' feedback on this, right? But David Foster Wallace says that this line of argument makes him uncomfortable, especially so when he applies it to other animals. And he mentions there's a giant lobster cooker at the festival, and we wouldn't tolerate such a festival that rounded up cows and slaughtered them in front of us, right? Yeah. We wouldn't do that. So that is kind of the PETA's point. Yeah. Now, we're going to have to develop this a little bit more, but so I'm not just kind of talking for 20 minutes straight. Let's get some feedback from Jordan and CJ.
Sure. So I think the one thing I want to touch on, I think what David Foster Wallace makes us think about is he says, well, even if we say it's primitive pain or primitive kind of suffering, isn't that still suffering? Because he mentions how the pamphlet to the Lobster Festival had this little factoid that, like you mentioned in the beginning, that a lobster's nervous system, or at least their brain or their neurological output or making, was the same as a grasshopper, which implies that, okay, they don't really feel the same kind of pain or suffering that we do. Mm-hmm. But then David Foster Wallace says, like, well, but isn't that just there's something odd about that? Because isn't suffering no matter how primitive or simple it could be.
I think you guys can tap into your experience with Marcus Aurelius and what he has to say about suffering and how much is the result of us fretting over the fact of pain that compounds suffering. Now, I will say that particular issue will be taken up in greater detail as we progress. But I think it's good to bracket it for right now.
Okay.
I want to keep developing things a little bit. But let's have that there.
Yeah, that's
great. Is that okay? Anything, Jordan? Anything else for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just like kind of the main consideration is suffering, but also how do different creatures experience suffering, and that sort of subjective nature.
So let's round this up a little bit and say something to the effect of maybe it's possible for there to be a distinction between pain and suffering, and what accounts for that might be the difference in brain structures.
Right.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Perhaps. So we're just going to put that in a big bracket there, and we're going to come. I promise you, we're going to address the Lobster Festival. We're going to address, what was your thing?
Tourism. That's the only thing I know.
We're going to talk about the differences in suffering and pain, the felt qualitative experiences. I promise. We will. Okay. So. So David Foster Wallace considers this argument. Okay, he says, we rationalize eating fish, lobster, and chicken because we don't believe them to have higher consciousness that allows for the feeling of pain. But he says we know that cows and pigs have higher consciousness and experience pain. Thus we say we are eating beef or pork. Such words are euphemisms to get us to suppress our uncomfortability with eating these animals. We don't say we are having cow or pig or Judy, maybe in your household, right?
Womp womp.
Womp womp. For dinner. Therefore, he says, we instinctually know, and yet we suppress it, that eating meat is wrong, but we have found a way to deceive ourselves by sort of renaming things. Now, I thought that was really interesting. And he does give us one counterexample. What was the counterexample to all of this? We call lobster and fish and chicken one thing, but we call cows and pigs pork and beef. But there's one counterexample. Yeah. What is it?
Lamb.
Lamb. Lamb is a lamb, right? Lamb is not a euphemism. There's a 1-to-1 ratio there. And he entertains this idea that there may be biblical reasons that make us feel okay about eating a lamb. Let's talk about that for a second. What might be some biblical reasons for eating lamb? Why we're okay with it, why we're okay with naming it in a 1-to-1 relation when we're not the same with cow and beef.
Sacrificial nature?
Precisely. Yeah. Like we're there, Jesus was the Lamb of God, right? And he was, if God can sacrifice a lamb, presumably we can kill and eat a lamb, right? And so that maybe this sort of talk, therefore, like an ancient text and biblical programming can soothe our unease about one category of consuming animals with higher consciousness.
And it might make us try to translate that into eating other animals. Dare I say, like lobster or like cows, where if we say, okay, well, if we do it in a way that respects the animal in a ritualistic or sacred way, then that we can justify it in some way. And David Foster Wallace is going to go further into explaining how we prepare lobster sometimes through just stabbing it in some way.
Why don't you talk about that a little bit? Because I didn't dwell as much as on that. I thought it was an interesting point, but I think you're bringing out a neat tension between the sacrifice of Jesus, the Lamb of God, and the sacrifice of the lobster by stabbing it through the eyes.
Because there's some sort of ethical justification, because when we boil lobster, David Foster Wallace mentions how most people can't take it, and that they'll put the lobster in the pot, boil it, and then walk out of the room and just carry a little timer with them. Just be like, okay, they're dead.
What can't they take?
They can't take the quote unquote suffering or the thrashing of the lobster.
Right.
But there's something about stabbing it, of taking full responsibility of the creature's life in your hands and witnessing the thrashing and pain, that gives it some sort of justification that...
Isn't there...
Yeah, well, Jordan, why don't you elaborate on that?
Isn't there some sort of like a strange sort of intimacy, right?
Yeah, so it's a kind of like Native American in that nature, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It comes to mind for me is kind of with like kosher slaughtering. Is that there's very highly ritualized, very specific ways that you can like butcher an animal.
And why is that preferable than just sort of throwing it into a pot or
respecting its I would say not, I mean like in a way like the sanctity of the animal, right? It's like respecting that it's like a part of creation, whether or not if you want to see that in a spiritual term or sort of more biocentric sort of
with native
terminology. I mean, either way, it's like respecting its existence by trying to end its life in a sort of dignified kind of way.
And that reminds me of the work of Temple Grandin, who, known for her animal husbandry and how she has worked with slaughterhouses, with cattle drives and all of that, and that she has this idea that we can reform husbandry in a way that respects the animal and respects not only the animal but its feelings, and we can try to reduce the fear and anxiety that is brought upon, say, an animal when it's brought to the slaughterhouse. Like she's not so much interested in trying to destroy the notion of killing animals or of destroying the slaughterhouse, but she's saying, how can we make it more humane, or how can we respect the animal, which brings in a whole other slew of messiness that David Foster Wallace, I think, is emphasizing. He's saying, look, there's counter arguments to counter arguments, but that's another.
So I think I've got something on that, and I think what was really important for you guys to pick out as this respect for the dignity of the animal, right, is that it can be used in all these different ways, right?
Right.
Okay. So not unlike how the Native Americans never let anything go to waste. It sounds like what Jordan is saying to me, if I'm hearing her correctly, that in sort of the kosher way of preparing an animal, that there's not anything that's really wasted. Is that kind of the way that I'm hearing you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. My understanding of kosher food is very, very, very limited. So anyone who does like practice kosher, dietary lifestyle, like please, like correct me. But it's my understanding usually that a lot of times when you kill an animal, their throat is slit.
Right.
And that's actually one of the more humane ways to do it.
Is it? Well, it'd be interesting if that's supported by science. I'm not sure. Yeah. I know it is by biblical tradition. I mean, that's how everything was executed in like the Old Testament and stuff like that. I'd be interested to know what the
in the ancient like mindset, usually slitting the throat was like a very.
But as we'll see, science complicates the issue. Yeah. Right? Is that things that we think are more humane, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, are actually not, because of the complicated nervous systems that we encounter. Because especially with the lobster, its nervous system is not like ours. So this other issue that CJ brought up about this person that was interested in animal husbandry. Who was it again?
Temple Grandin. She's also known, at least for, she's autistic, so she does a lot of work with autism and then also with animal husbandry and stuff like that.
Right. Well, so some people are deeply troubled by just boiling a lobster alive, right? Yeah. And so, And so David Foster Wallace, he's like, would it be permissible to eat lobster if the killing process was more humane in some way, like to prevent the suffering, right? Like we talked about with the knife through the ice. Some kill with a knife, but because of the decentralized nervous system, this doesn't amount to an act of mercy. Because, right, its brain's not really in one place. It's spread out throughout the body. So, and you could make the case that you're actually adding insult to injury. You're actually compounding the suffering that's made. He considers another option. Do you remember what the other option was?
Was it boiling it? Yeah.
Slowly elevating the temperature of the water. Not unlike how they do with frogs. Because a frog will go from the regular temperature to the high temperature and not jump out of the pot. Mm-hmm. Not the case with lobsters. It's actually more cruel because they have hairs covering their entire body that are hypersensitive to changes in their environment, right? So you're actually prolonging the process. Further, given their primitive nervous system, they can't absorb opioids or endorphins like higher animals who may experience some relief in death. Like, there's a lot of talk about, like, when we are confronting death, we have near-death experiences, and, like, there might be a flood of endorphins or whatever. Lobsters do not have that same neurological apparatus that would allow them to have that sort of epiphany in death. Or euphoria in death.
Or just like the slitting of the throat that you mentioned, where maybe, like, a cow would experience, like, have the endorphins, and that it wouldn't be as crazy as just, like, breaking like all its limbs. Yeah.
So he concludes, therefore, there's no humane way to circumvent the suffering of a lobster. Eating it is morally impermissible according to the criteria. But I'm not sure if this applies to other meats. Like, for instance, with a chicken. If you just, like, we have to do a consider the chicken essay. But, like, if you take an axe to a chicken, like, what kind of level of pain does it experience? I know they run around with their heads cut off, right, for a little while, but, like, what's the subject that's experiencing that? Those are sort of like muscle reactions, right? Like, what's going on in its brain? Probably nothing.
Well, that's the justification, right, of even just killing a lobster, is that, and we get this whole idea of behaviorist thought, where I'll quote, I think, B.F. Skinner, who said something along the lines of, I think this was Temple Grandin actually, like, talking to him, where he's like, we don't have to know how the brain works. It's just a matter of conditioned reflexes, right? Where this idea of preference to temperature for the lobster, that could just be, it's just a conditioned reflex in the animal. It's not actually a preference. It isn't actually a means of suffering, right? Where it's like, I don't want to be like this way, so I'm going to suffer because the temperature is not right. It's just, it's just a reflex. And I think that goes to what David Foster Wallace mentions about how sometimes we can justify killing animals because we think they are automata, or we think they're machines. That goes back to Descartes.
Yeah. And for people that don't know, I mean, Descartes had that idea, and I think I have to brush up on this, but I think he was so curious about biology and things like that. I think he may have been interested in live vivisection. So, but he was able to justify it.
But because it's just machines.
It's just machinery. Yeah. That I have to check on that. Do not quote me on that.
But it's an extension of that way of thought.
Yeah. Well, all right. So I hope I didn't dismiss the concerns earlier. About the differences in qualitative pain, because that's going to come back in there. Right. And I just wanted to make it apply to this argument that I'm going to lay out here, because now it's going to be very, very relevant in light of everything that we talked about. I just want to make sure we followed a sequential order here.
Yeah, go ahead.
So David Foster Wallace considers a counter-argument about the qualitative nature of lobster pain. And we've already sort of danced around it a little bit, but I'm going to say a little bit more about it. Since lobsters lack a cerebral cortex, their pain may be qualitatively different from ours. Pain may register, yet they don't dislike it. And David Foster Wallace talks about how some examples of, like, mental patients who've had, like, lobotomies or whatever can say, like, oh, that hurts, but, like, are really unaffected by it. They don't seem to mind it too much. And so this raises this distinction, this difference between pain as a neurological event and suffering, an emotional event. Like I spoke to earlier about how Marcus Aurelius talked about how when we worry over things, we make it spiral out of control. I'm not reading Marcus Aurelius incorrectly. That's right? Am I good with my Marcus Aurelius? If just a neurological event, then the animal doesn't suffer. And that's traceable to Descartes. Merely responds like a reflex. And this would make eating the lobster and perhaps other animals that lack a cerebral cortex permissible on the criteria set out by Singer. Right? However, the animal thrashes about in the pot, wishing to avoid the painful experience. And this goes to what CJ just said about preference. This is the preference of the animal and indicates real suffering. Worms, on the other hand, don't show a preference when they are split in two. They just keep moving. No suffering going on with worms because they seem not to have a preference. You just bifurcate them and they just keep going. Right? Or like those flathead worms. They'll grow other heads and stuff like that. Therefore, lobsters appear to suffer on a primitive level, and the only way to decide otherwise is if your moral conscience is driven by a countervailing ideology. So, the argument against the idea of lobsters being automatons is the fact that they can express a preference.
Right.
Is that a good argument? Now, I'm going to hand it over to you guys to talk about this qualitative difference between suffering and preference and pain.
I think that's the thing David Foster Wallace is trying to grapple with, and I think what we do too, because wouldn't we, if we were thrown in a boiling pot, also try to reach out and get out of there, right? That even if it is a primitive reaction, it is still a reaction that is quite relevant to what a sentient creature like ourselves as human beings would do as well. So there's this unease that even if we can justify it via, behavioral psychology of animals or anything like that, or that they're automata, it's still uncomfortable. And I think that's maybe one thing when we're talking about this, I think that we're running into again and again, is that no matter how we can justify any of these things, there's still some sort of unease and nausea that kind of occurs in our minds when we think about these things. And what I think David Foster Wallace talks about. But did you feel the same way? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if anything, this essay provided more problems for me than any sort of concrete solutions. And I think that when we deal with animals, there's a tendency to project sort of an anthropomorphic sort of lens onto animals. You know what I mean? Like, we tend to sort of humanize, like, our pets, and we tend to project a lot of human qualities and tendencies on animals. But then there's also that kind of, like, thing I'm struggling with, where it's like, there's also a tendency for us as humans to say that we're superior and kind of construct a narrative that enables us to sort of assert an almost unfair amount of dominance at the food chain, and kind of destroy a lot of, our habitat for ourselves and other creatures. So that's the tension that I see sort of bound up in this pain versus suffering.
Well, doesn't it go back to the tension of the torus that he talked about, right? Where you're economically superior but existentially repugnant, and that maybe this idea of cooking animals or just killing animals, that it supposes, like you said, the superiority, and yet at the same time it's existentially and ethically and philosophically confounding and at times repugnant, and that having to face that is an ongoing debate. Because I don't know if you want to get into the ending.
Yeah, I do.
But let's get into the ending, because I don't think he even really knows. He's just like, I'm just
he doesn't
confused.
have any answers either. Like, I think that we're all kind of just like in this like murky, like, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think so. I will submit that you analogize what we would be like in the boiling pot and what the lobster would be like in the boiling pot, and I think there would be a categorical difference. All right.
Yeah.
Well, so as the lobster is dying, it may have a preference and it may be uncomfortable and not like it. If I were a lobster, we know it'd be really interesting. We should look at Kafka's Metamorphosis, because he gets turned into a bug there, and you have to consider the subjective point of view of a bug, and lobsters are essentially bugs. If I were a lobster and I was thrown into a giant pot, yes, I would be uncomfortable. Maybe I would be hurting. Well, there's a thought that I would be having that the lobster is not having. Presumably, the lobster's not having.
What would it be?
Death.
Yeah, consciousness of death.
My utter destruction. Right? And what that means. What does one's utter destruction mean? Does that mean I'm going to meet God? Does that mean I'm going to meet the devil? Does that mean I'm not atoned for my sins? Does that mean I don't get to carry out my future projects?
Right. What have I done in my past
life?
What
have I done?
Yeah.
Right.
So what I'm trying to say here is there is a categorical difference about boiling a human alive, or a human that's been turned into a bug, versus a lobster. Now, I'm not saying that is enough to make the distinction worthwhile, but my suffering, I'm going to wager, if it could be qualitatively compared, is going to be greater than this giant sea bug.
Right.
Now, it's still, on utilitarian standards, maybe my suffering doesn't outweigh 50,000 lobsters being boiled alive. And if given the choice, you ought to boil a Luke Johnson, not only because he's pompous, but
I can think of lots of reasons to boil it.
Consider the Luke Johnson.
But continue.
He's pompous, he's pretentious, he gaslights, he does all these things. Right? But if you add up enough subjective experiences of bugs, well, the seesaw battle goes against him. Right? Or goes for him, depending on how you look at it.
But I think what David Foster Wallace is confused about is that as much as you can say that, Luke, isn't there still something that gnaws at your conscience, even if it is completely logically concluded that, okay, a lobster's suffering isn't the same as mine.
Yeah.
It may be quote unquote primitive, but it's still this thing that I'm uneasy about.
Yeah.
Why am I uneasy about it?
Yeah.
I mean, we could also think of that unease kind of almost being a privilege, though, because we have to think about with industrialized food that there's so much of an abundance. So we have that sort of like hesitancy of, do we eat it? I don't know. But, I mean, when, like, there's, like, genuine hunger, are you gonna really feel bad for that lobster? I know I wouldn't. I'd be like, in you go, buddy, like, down the hatch. You know?
Yeah, and even David Foster Wallace mentions that, too, where he says, a lot of this discussion, in some ways, like, there's privilege, and he says, well, I like to eat meat, and I would like to continue eating meat, but how I'm going to have to do philosophical and ethical gymnastics in order to justify that, I don't really know. And then he's like, what do you guys think? I mean, there's people that read Gourmet Magazine, like, what do you guys...
I think we're going to have to talk about that, because ultimately he gets this idea that his taste for a certain type of flesh outweighs a certain lobster, and he has no defensible ethical principle for this. So he's confused, he's working out his ideas in open space. And I want us to consider here in our first discussion question, and I want to bring back to Jordan's point about looking at the medieval, the Lobster Festival is sort of this medieval torture event. All right, that was the other thing I was trying to remember that was yours. Right, is that if we are convinced that we ought not to be eating lobster, then this is the most medieval, archaic thing, and we ought to be embarrassed by it, and we ought to recognize that right now and end it immediately. But he doesn't feel that way. And he's trying to understand why he doesn't feel this way. So we have to think of what is the prevailing ideology that counteracts the animal rights arguments of Singer. Now, look, I'm just going to say this, and I'm going to let you guys talk. Okay? If I did not believe in God, I would be a vegetarian. The only thing that allows me to eat other animals is that I believe that I have a special place in creation. But if I was like David Foster Wallace, or like any good secular progressive, and didn't believe in God, I see no choice but vegetarianism. You're to discuss. That's all I got.
You go, TJ.
I don't really know how to respond to that, but I think I can add to it that even in a secular view too, in religious as well, that maybe a justification is that human beings do have a special part in the world. I mean, even think of the idea of Adam naming the animals, right? And of being this caretaker of the world. And not even caretaker, but
God gave him dominion.
Dominion over the creatures and the birds of the air and the creatures of the sea, including the lobster. That there's some sort of elevation that gives us, even secularly.
So how does it do it secularly? If you don't believe in God, how could you possibly eat an animal?
Maybe it is that idea of the neuroscience of it, of saying, okay, well, if they don't feel the same way as we do. I think it's funny when you mentioned that line of argument that maybe they're like frontal lobotomy patients. I remember reading in the essay David Foster Wallace is like, and my optimism increases as I write this, this factoid down or something like that, where he's like, oh, well, that gives me hope that if they don't experience pain the way we do, and don't quote unquote suffer, then maybe I can eat them and that would be okay. But
what's Jordan want to say?
I mean, I think that we kind of have to take it like a little bit. I think of it kind of like a little bit like Marcus Aurelius in that there's sort of this cosmopolitan view, and like that's kind of like almost like a predecessor, right, to a biocentric view, which is like we all have this sort of place, maybe not necessarily sanctioned by some sort of like higher being, but we have our own sort of like place in our ecosystem. And I've happened across last night this interesting article called "How to Be a Conscious and Responsible Omnivore." And so it's like interesting because it kind of goes through how to, sort of mull through the ethics of this. And they even kind of take a stab at vegetarians. And this one's dietitian says, quote, "Somebody gets eaten, and that's something we all have to deal with. It's natural to participate in this web by eating other animals." And Kay's not just talking about animals. If you think plants aren't operating on a level of having emotions and consciousness, think again. Just in the last few years, there have been conferences on plant neurology and plant communication.
Yeah.
End quote.
Plants do communicate.
So,
it depends on how you define it. Like like trees, through their root systems and things like that will communicate to one another. But is it like our communication?
Yeah, but I think that if we still sort of think that, different, like life forms other than us have, a lot of complicated, systems and nuances and these things that we don't necessarily fully appreciate, I guess, or fully understand. To me, that almost just seems to appreciate the whole system even more, and in a backwards way that makes me more okay participating in it.
But aren't you worried that that's the article, that's the voice of someone who's at the top of the food chain? Let's think of it like a if there were these hyper intelligent aliens that could dominate us in any way and be like, "Hey, look, we love humans. We have to eat you." Would we not rebel?
There's a wonderful...
I mean, I don't know.
I want Jordan to respond.
I mean, I don't know. I would say, like...
You'd be cool with that?
I mean, I'd be like, please don't eat me or, like, domesticate me and I'll be your pet first. But, like, yeah, if I'm dinner, I'm dinner.
You'd be okay with an alien eating you?
Yeah.
There's a wonderful...
I mean, cannibalism. Like, that's, like, you know what I mean? Like, that's...
Are you okay with humans eating other humans?
Well,
boom.
We still do it. So I mean, the thing is
it permissible? Is the question I'm asking. That article would seem to make it permissible.
Yeah, I mean, in my viewpoint, cannibalism's okay. Like we have all these sort of cultural mores and taboos against it, but again, because it's a lot of like with cannibalism, it's how you acculturate and treat your dead, or if you naturalize them. So a lot of food practices. A lot of it boils down to how to like acculturation and naturalizing it. So if you naturalize the human body and how we relate in nature, then to answer your question, yes, I'd be okay with being cannibalized, and yes, I'd be okay being eaten by aliens.
I'd fight that, but I guess like just for the sake of your claim about cannibalization, I think you'd be okay with your body being eaten if you were not murdered, right? There's a big difference between being murdered and cannibalized and dying of natural causes and then being cannibalized.
Well, I don't know. I mean, okay, like
presumably one is
like preferable, but like if I'm already on my way out, like if you if the three of us were in like some sort of survival situation,
like alive,
and if it was like, okay, like who has to be eaten,
so there's
I'd probably be like, yeah, okay, I guess me, like I guess.
So there's a special ethical situation for this cannibalism to actually be permissible.
Mm-hmm.
There's a wonderful
book.
There's a wonderful book by Michelle Faber called Under the Skin that elaborates on this through fiction, through science fiction, where there's this higher form of alien that comes to Earth, and it's this small little, almost like a small little hunting center, and they scoop up, it seems like this woman scoops up hitchhikers and then brings them back. Or she has to find out whether they're, lean and of intelligent quality. And then she sends them back and puts them into the house or into this, industrial system to be slaughtered. And I don't want to give away. I think I gave away too much of the story. There's a movie version with Scarlett Johansson that's also rather interesting.
What's it called?
Under the Skin. But it brings up this idea where, okay, there's this higher, like you said, there's this higher being, and they look at us and they say, oh, these Homo sapiens, they're very strange creatures, and she actually has to. These creatures actually have an extra ligament, and she has to blend in, so she has to like cut it off. That's her special job, is to blend in with the human beings. But it brings into this idea where it's like, okay, well, what, like you said, what if there is this higher sentient being and we're just like cattle? Like what does that introduce into our mind frame?
It kind of reminds me a little bit of and I think we'll come across it soon with Montaigne and cannibals. And, all of these, like, priests are coming in and they're trying to, convert and all this stuff. And, a lot of the, like, natives in Mexico are saying, okay, so you're telling us that you eat the body of Christ and drink this guy's blood, and you're saying we can't do the same? Like, what's up with that?
Yep.
Yeah. So that sort of... Yes, I mean, it's still, like, it's in our culture.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is this something, then, that we can even solve? Is it ever going to
I've solved it. It's not an issue for me.
Right.
But
I think Luke and I made peace with
for me,
our options.
Like, the God hypothesis makes a lot of these problems go away from me. But it does introduce another problem for me.
Yeah.
Can I bring that up?
Please.
Okay. So, now... the God hypothesis allows me to avoid cannibalism. It allows me to fight off aliens. It allows me to eat beings that are lower than me. So I don't have these problems. All right. But what it does do is it forces me to reinterpret what it means to have dominion over God's creation. All right. So now I can eat a lobster that perhaps I catch by myself. Right. Right. But to engage in the industrialization of food becomes a problem, because God gave man dominion over the earth. He didn't say beat it into annihilation.
Right.
He didn't say
exploitation.
So the question is, for me as a Christian, ought I to not participate in the industrialization of the food complex, or whatever the thing is called?
Yeah.
And the question for me is, where do I draw the line with that? Do I never go to Chick-fil-A or McDonald's or any sort of fast food place or anywhere? If I'm ever going to eat meat, does it have to come from the farm that I live on?
Yeah, I mean, that goes to the part of the question that he poses in the beginning, right? Gustatory pleasure. That we can have the things that go beyond simple, just use it for your own... need at the moment. Like you said, I caught a lobster. I need to eat it because I need to sustain myself. I think John Muir, the great environmentalist and nature writer, he said something similar to lumber, where he's like, okay, like, no doubt these trees, and I'll quote him, no doubt these trees would make good lumber after passing through a sawmill, as George Washington, after passing through the hands of a French cook, would have made good food. That death is death, right? We kill trees. We kill animals. Okay. Regardless if we put it to good use. And I think maybe it's like the good use part that we're trying to justify, right? Or maybe that's at the crux of your thought. Maybe not good use, I mean, or to the extent of like, what is good use? Like, can it extend further to just pleasure?
Presumably God would want his subjects to exercise wisdom in the dominion over his creation. So what
is wisdom, right?
What is the wise use of it? I think.
What is good use?
And that may be contextual, right? There may be, like, in general, if we don't need to engage in factory farming, we ought not to do it. Mm-hmm. But like, if there's like a famine somewhere, like in North Korea or Africa or something like that, and we have to engage in the industrialization of killing animals and preparing them and stuff like that, it may be permissible to help those people out because they deserve dignity underneath a Judeo-Christian worldview. Right. Yeah. So maybe in those crisis situations, it would be something permissible. So maybe it's a flexible sort of prohibition.
Yeah, and I think that's what maybe Dave Foster Wallace is. If any conclusion, I think we get that when dealing with animals, it's this really flexible messy situation where we have a lot of arguments, counter arguments, and even things just to blanket our thoughts about this. And even, like you said, where he compares it to, like the Roman Colosseum, he's like, I think that, and I'm like, that's stupid, that's whimsical. And then he's like, wait, why do I think it's whimsical and psychotic and stupid? Why do I think somebody painting themselves as a lobster and giving me stickers that's like, being boiled hurts is extreme? Why do I think that? And it's just... This just reminds me, it's just a Pandora's box.
It is. And I think we need to bring this conversation to a close, given some time constraints.
Yeah.
So I want to give Jordan the last word before we close everything out.
Oh. Well, I guess, I don't know, like, how to conclude it. I mean, I think that, I would say, like, seeing that we've been eating for thousands of years, I would say that we have a very complex relationship with food and animals, given our 10,000 year stretch with domesticating animals.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't think there are any clear answers, but I think that David Foster Wallace does an excellent job sort of like laying out the groundwork for these sort of big questions in a very compact, enlightening essay.
It's almost as if he just opens a Pandora's box.
Yeah, it does. He did for me, at least.
Yeah. Very thoughtful essay. Yep. I want to thank you both for such a spirited discussion. I really appreciate the external materials that you brought to this. I thought it made it especially enjoyable. And if you would like to take this with you and listen to it elsewhere, please download the Noetic app. It's for your iPhone and Android devices, and we'll be back with some new stuff next week. All right, see you guys.
Consider the turkey.